Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bonnie Dorsey, and I'm a CCFM staff member, and I'll be helping out with this session today. I'll be around in a few minutes with this sign-in sheet. I know you already know the drill about the AIA credits, and please write neatly so they can read your email address and all the rest of the information. This is a 1-hour session, COV2510, Parish Consolidation and Unification. This session is 1 hour, and it is certified with AIA for 1 learning unit. It is my pleasure to introduce Michael Egan. He is an American Institute of Architecture architect, and Michael is a principal and director of faith-based design with Browning Day. Please welcome him here today. And after he gets a quick drink, because he's been talking nonstop for over an hour, he'll begin. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. So maybe you understand the presentation. A little background on myself. I'm an architect from Indianapolis. Grew up Catholic. Been serving the Catholic Church for 43 years. Most of that has been focused on faith-based and or Catholic work. So that's what I do. I head up our, at Browning Day, I head up our faith-based, I'm the director of faith-based design. And so we are doing things like a new monastery for the Benedictine sisters in Beech Grove, Indiana, working on a new retreat house in Evansville, Indiana. Done new churches, renovated churches, schools, parochial schools, athletic facilities, all associated with Catholic institutions. So that's me, so you know where I come from. Here today to talk to you about parish consolidation and unification and some of the reasons behind that, and the importance of, I'll say, following process. I want to share with you what I think are factors that influence the consolidation of parishes. The importance of strategic planning, that we think through where we're headed before we start that journey. I want to share key criteria that help determining a direction. I want to share what I believe are good methods of gathering information and involving the community in the process. I want to make you aware of the importance of a realistic budget, that we don't do things that I did early in my career where I got talked out of a contingency. And then we fought that the whole way through the project. I learned that early on. And just the recognition that the right process will get you all back, will get a parish back to their core mission, and understand, you're not here to build buildings, right? That's just helps us along the way. You're gonna be dealing with a lot of people along the way. And I like to use this little cartoon to try to depict that. There's going to be a lot of people looking over your shoulder, and they're looking over my shoulder too when I'm working. And even the guy on scaffolding with binoculars up there, that sat there for a half an hour, he already knows more than the building committee, the long-range planning committee, and the architect put together, right? I'm mentioning that because it's important to you want to involve the parish, but the opposite, in my opinion, the opposite of good stewardship is to say, invite the whole parish along, let them hear the presentation for 45 minutes and then vote on it. Who likes A and who likes B and who likes C? To me, that's the opposite of stewardship. Stewardship is, you're called to serve on a committee because of your skills or your faith or some combination of those things. And you're there to discern and to ruminate over things and to pray about things. And a good committee will do that. A good committee will spend a lot of time looking at this information and making a recommendation to a parish. And so it's an informed, there's no way you can inform the whole parish of all the factors that you've studied in a process. So, not to be a Debbie Downer, but here's some facts. And, I grew up in the 60s, and I remember, we had 3 priests in our parish the whole time I was growing, all 8 or 12 years of Catholic education. And maybe some of you remember that, but it's not that way anymore. We would have in 1965 we had 1,500 ordinations in a year, and now we have 450, or in 2002. Our retirements are way out of balance now with a number of still active priests. And I shared this comment about Sarah Club. It's no wonder that the Sarah Club is aging. For those of you who don't know who the Sarah Club is, I'm a Saran, and we pray for and promote vocations to religious life. And I'm mentioning this because I think there's hope. Yes, that says that the Sarah Club is reducing in size, but I'll tell you that the Archdiocese of our club is growing, and we've aged, and now we're growing, and it's going to take that. It's going to take prayer to improve our situation. There's fewer active Catholics, even though our population is growing. The involvement of Catholics in regular Mass has gone down, in marriages, baptisms, all that is we're less involved than we were. It's a little bit different of a church. There's financial factors and operational things. There were a lot of facilities built after World War II and the Korean War. Some built, after World War I or 1900s, early 1900s. But, the stuff that was built in the 50s and 60s, I can sit there and go, well, we added that school was added on to when I was a kid. That's not old. Yeah, it's probably 70 years old, or 50 or 60. I'm not 70, but, you don't realize that. And there were a lot of parishes built in that era. And they may not have been painted since then, The workforce is different. If I think about, trying to hire architects and engineers and contractors, there isn't that workforce out there, and I'm sure that's affected other industries. And, parishes are much more lay-driven now, and I'm sure they have challenges as well. You all have challenges as well. If you think about in the 60s, we had a real cheap labor workforce. The sisters were teaching all of our kids, and we don't have that anymore. So it's a different workforce. There's population shifts, folks move a little further away from the city. It's suburbanizing and whatnot. And so what was a thriving parish, my parish, which was in a suburb when I was a kid, is now on the edge of inner city and, contracted, okay? So many communities are going through many of these things. As we think about where we're headed, we always encourage folks to think about strategic planning and understanding their vision of their parish, their mission, before they embark on any kind of solution. Because and I'll skip to the fourth one there. I'm sorry. Yeah, the fourth one of defining success, and making sure your efforts are ministry-driven, not facility-driven. I've been involved in projects where, or at least the beginning of projects where, we're gonna look at all our buildings and then we're gonna figure out what we're gonna do. Well, that's a valuable thing to do, assess your buildings, but that really shouldn't be the controlling factor of what you're gonna do as a parish. There are other things. Make sure you understand the facts. What do we know about our parishes? What don't we know? We might know that there's going to be a development of housing over here, but we don't know how many, or we don't know how many of those families are going to be Catholic, or we don't know how many of those Catholic families are going to be active. How many of those Catholic families are going to have kids and send them to our school, So there's a lot of stuff out there that you kind of need to put on your list and weigh as you're beginning and thinking through strategically what you're doing. As we begin a feasibility study, there's different ways we collect information. We interview folks and we have workshops. When we interview folks, we'll interview ministry leaders. So we might do 10, 12, 15 ministry leaders from a parish, somebody from the school and somebody from worship and music and St. Vincent de Paul and just generally understand what their efforts encompass and what kind of space needs they have. And we'll create a program. It'll be a pretty loose program because this is just a feasibility study. If we have multiple sites, we'll do site analysis of each site inventory, and then we'll work with the long-range planning committee on what we feel are the assets and liabilities of each site, and we'll try to reach consensus on that. We'll then go and study different options and create budgets for each option, and these are very high-level options of, it's this much square footage, it's this much development of acreage, it's these utilities, and try to help them understand the budget implications of whether we stay on this site, whether we go to that site, whether we combine things. Once we have a pretty good plan, we make sure that the parish council and finance council of the parish support our sort of recommendation, and I say our recommendation, I mean the long-range planning committee and us, and we review that with diocesan leadership because it's important to keep them involved. Once we have some kind of consensus of those groups, we would go out to the entire parish and present a recommendation, making sure we are willing to listen in case things come up that we get pushback on, that maybe we evaluated differently than what different groups might have done, the general parish might have evaluated. But we have to be flexible that way. We then would look at, I'm going to give you two examples in a moment here of two different consolidations. But we've got multiple sites, right? And so we need to look at each site and say, what's their location within the community, within the deanery. We might be, a good site might be too close to something else in the surrounding deanery in terms of another parish. Where's our population in relation to the parishes that are being considered? How easily can you drive, vehicular access, surrounding roadway structure, utilities, that sort of thing. All those should be evaluated for each site. How big is a site? You probably have sites, some of you, that are probably 3 or 4 acres, and that worked in 1900, for a parish. It probably doesn't work now, because we got cars and we've got schools and now we have soccer fields and all kinds of stuff, right? And so you have to account for that. That's part of the assessment. What kind of condition is your site in? The parkings and drives, do they serve things properly? Is there a cross between vehicular and pedestrian circulation that doesn't work? Does the site drain? Things like that. If you don't have enough space, what do? You got to be creative. Do you? This is being facetious here, but how do you find space? Do you put your pastor in a van and now you've made space that you don't have a rectory anymore, or you have a mobile rectory? But if you take that just idea and say, some dioceses say this is our site and the rectory needs to be on that site, which is maybe a good idea, maybe not, or maybe it's immediately adjacent, or maybe it's in the neighborhood that's adjacent. I would suggest that a priest may not want to live in the middle of the place of everybody that he serves. But you got to be creative, and you got to be not afraid to, I'll say, break the rules or challenge the diocese or whatever to say, yeah, I know we want a rectory on every site, but here's the situation. We need to assess buildings and understand their general condition. What's significant about them? Are they historical? Is there a real emotional connection, a sentimental connection, certainly a spiritual connection depending on the building type? Is there ability to repurpose something, because and it might be for parish use and it might be for some other function, because maybe you want to sell that piece. Or is that piece of property, that building, in such condition that it's not usable? How we deal with workshops is we try to, when a parish wants a large group of folks together to participate, we'll conduct workshops. And we break those into smaller groups, maybe 6, no more than 10 folks. And you get a smaller group, people are more likely to interact and dialogue about things. We try to identify a spokesperson that then reports things back, and we introduce all this criteria to each of those groups. So if you have multiple campuses, you've got a mix of people in each grouping of people. It's not just St. Paul here and St. Joe here and St. Louis de Montfort there. You're mixing these folks from different parishes so you get a good dialogue about things. They evaluate the assets and liabilities of each site. You have somebody that comes back and reports things, and you assign a facilitator that keeps the dialogue going, that it doesn't get bogged down into someone's personal vendetta or strong opinion or loud voice. You keep it moving. We also want to keep our diocesan leadership informed. There's plenty of advice and knowledge from you folks that needs to be tapped into. Guidance that folks need because they haven't done this before. And we want to keep the bishop informed, and we want support from the diocese. And I've seen that the bishops want that. The bishop doesn't want to dictate stuff, and he wants a community to come to an agreement on what they ought to do and test that back with their parish, with their diocesan leadership, with their parish leadership. And then the other important thing is to come up with a way to measure your success before you really pursue things. In this situation, you can see this is a meeting note where on one of these I'm going to show you, this next one I'm going to show you, we said 75% was the way we were going to measure success, if we could get agreement on that. So this is what became St. John Paul II. This is in Sellersburg, Indiana. And there were two parishes. There was St. Joe Hill, which is out in the country, a country church, over 100 years old, been there forever. And there was St. Paul, which was built in town in the 70s, probably late 60s, early 70s. And it was on the main highway at the time. Okay? And then later on, an interstate got built, kind of cut Sellersburg in half. We looked at those two sites, and then we had a greenfield site here and a greenfield site here, which were huge, 70 and 48 acres. But you can see there's less than 4 acres at St. Paul's and almost 60 acres over here at St. Joe Hill. So we began evaluating those, and we looked at parish population, and you just do a little diagram to locate all your parishioners. And what we learned was, well, that interstate kind of cut things in half, and a good portion of folks, a better portion of folks live on this side, and that was where the growth of the community was headed, okay? So you're looking at where folks live, where things are growing and moving. And then we looked at each site, okay? And so this is the St. Paul site. You can see it's very long and narrow. They have parking up here. This is like a gym and an early childhood center. This was a 2-story, like second through 8th grade, a convent, garage, and then their church, okay? Which was a pretty small, low ceiling, probably lower than this, kind of 70s sort of building. And then the rectory was kind of in the neighborhood, around the corner here. If they were going to build a 700-seat church, which what we did was we put a program together for 700, parking, athletic facilities, a school, that sort of thing, and we said, what would that mean? And so without really doing a true master plan, we just look at how much space things take. We know how big a worship space for 700 is going to be. We looked at expanding their school, and we looked at parking to support that, okay, mostly driven by the worship space, okay? And then you can see play fields, baseball and soccer, football, and whatnot. And you can see it's just, look how many properties that takes there, okay? So we did the same thing on each site. We were a little concerned, too, that what we didn't realize, or we realized after time, was that this round thing is the water tower. And so we figured, well, maybe they would call it Our Lady of the Water Tower or something. That didn't go over very big. But so we had the one site. We looked at, what are the pros and cons to each site, It's in a prime location right now, people know them. They have a reputable they've got a reputable school. And maybe they could sell St. Joe's property and fund the project. Because, as I said, housing and things were growing out that direction. The disadvantages were they got to buy a lot of property. I mean, that is just enormous. That was probably 20 properties there. Almost impossible to get all that and not spend a ton of money. And even if they could, that really only addressed their short-term needs, Long-term, that wasn't going to solve things. There were traffic concerns because they were so close to that state highway. So this is what the committee generated. We then looked at the other site, which was pretty easy. It's 60 acres. They had on the hill was the school and the church and everything. They had a gymnasium down here, and rather than study what it meant to tie into that, we just said, well, we got plenty of space to connect and add on to the gym and build a new school, because the old school is in bad shape. Build a new church, because you're not going to add on to that church. Plenty of parking, athletic fields. I mean, it was pretty easy to sort of say, you got the space here, okay? And we looked at the pros and cons to each one. You know, you could pretty much do anything and everything you wanted on this site. You know, the negatives were things that could be studied pretty easily. You know, that they might lose some bus service with the public schools. Could they get the city to improve St. Joe Road because it was pretty narrow? The perceived distance from the highway really didn't turn out to be an issue. And because we weren't reusing the old buildings, the higher cost to maintain older buildings wasn't an issue. And then we looked at the other two sites, which the difference became, we're building the same amount of square footage, it's the site development cost. And, you know, these had no infrastructure to them, so they were more, not significantly, but they were more. We then took all four of these because Father Tom wanted to involve as many parishioners as he could. So we voted, which is not something we usually recommend. I like to reach consensus. So we did a version of voting, I guess. We put all four options up. And the criteria was, or the selection criteria was, you can vote, your vote was, I can support that option, or I can live with that option, or I can't live with that option. And you could vote for every one of them, or none of them, or two or three of them was the deal. And if you remember, you saw those meeting notes, we said 75% was our success factor. We ended up getting almost 80%. And then the other three got less than 20% in each one. So it was clear that there was one option that was markedly better, which was the St. Joe Hill site. They owned the property, there was enough of it, and the biggest hurdle probably was convincing the St. Paul people that we were going to build at St. Joe Hill, which the way we dealt with that was I suggested to Father that he put one of the biggest challengers of the process on the project. And, you know, he was a gentleman that had really built the other parish, you know. It was his baby. He had built the school, he had built the church, he maintained stuff, and man, his heart was at St. Paul's. And by golly, he didn't know why we were doing this, but he was reasonable. And by the end of the project, by the time we started construction, Father named him as our contact during construction. I mean, that's how he completely turned around and became a proponent of the project and got the new church built, which became phase one. So they ended up going to St. Joe Hill. The parish became called St. John Paul II. And then there were elements within that design that combined those parishes. For instance, there were shrines to both St. Paul and St. Joseph, okay, that were, you know, significant, and other things. The second project I wanted to show you, so that one was really driven by, there was only one pastor serving both of those parishes, okay? This was driven by, St. Francis Xavier was driven by 4 parishes that were aging, mostly in an urban area, and had already been unified, so to speak, but they still were having Mass in every one of those parishes. They were still paying insurance and maintenance on every one of those buildings and every one of those other parishes, even though they had become one unified parish. So when we start out, we talk about folks, you know, that when we present things to parishioners, we ask them for their support or for their input. I mean, we're there to get information, and we're also looking for their support, and we tell them that right off the bat. This was a particular statement from the pastor who kind of reminded them of why they were there, and that how were they doing so far. And it was very powerful. You know, an architect can lead an effort, but the spiritual side needs to come from the priest. And he gave a very passionate witness to the parishioners, and I think it really helped. You know, these are the 4 parishes, or the 4 churches. And as you can see, they're beautiful buildings, you know. There's nothing that isn't, here I'm going to be trying to tell them you need to leave one or some of these, right? So you kind of have to start with the facts. And so we went through each building, and we figured out, what kind of condition they were in, And these weren't real detailed assessments. They were very high-level assessments, but you could easily go in and say, well, Sacred Heart, they sandblasted that a number of years ago, and good luck with that one. You're not going to beat that one. You're going to sink a ton of money into fixing that. And St. John the Baptist, the trusses were splitting. We got in the attic, and somebody had done a structural report on it, and it wasn't in such good shape. St. Thomas was really too far out and way too small. And St. Vincent was an old orphanage. It had a small church, and was probably in the best condition of any of them. So then we looked at where these are all located, and it was pretty. Folks said, St. Thomas. Well, first of all, St. Francis Xavier is a basilica on the Wabash. I forget. I think it's Wabash right there, and that wasn't going to change. Okay, it's the other 4 parishes we're talking about, and you can see that 3 of them are pretty much in town. And then this one out here. Well, if I measure from there to there, that's 10 miles, which is, a good distance, and they didn't have any land or anything like that. So we kind of wrote that one off. But you'll see these are very tight sites, and this one is a 60-acre site, or more than 100 acres, actually. The perception was, St. Vincent de Paul, that's too far out. That's outside the belt, and when we measured it, it's like 3.5 miles, okay? It's like 10 minutes. I'm mentioning that because you kind of have to tell people that, that you got to give them the facts, It's only 10 minutes, and that changed people's perspective. We went to each site, and, the first one was St. John the Baptist, really a city block with a little bit of space over here, less than an acre, okay? It was a cruciform plan. This is the one where the trusses were failing, so very significant repairs there. And it's very narrow, long and narrow. And there's really not that much space. And we counted their parking around the perimeter and whatnot. We gave them one option of just making it longer, rebuilding that crossing and making the element longer, the worship space longer, and what it would take to, what it would take to acquire some land for additional parking, okay? And even the possibility of a parish hall / gymnasium that could serve the school, because the school does not have a gym. They play ball in the cafeteria. And I mean cafeteria, low ceiling cafeteria. We also gave them an idea of, well, what if you did more of a centralized plan? And what we learned from all of that is they've got 4 very traditional churches, and they want a traditional church, So that wasn't going to work so well for them, even though we were able to get more parking, and meet their need. That was not going to work for them. We did a little bit of studies three-dimensionally because it is a little hard for folks to follow just site plans. Just to give them an idea of what we thought we would do is capture that as their gathering space, which is one of the functional, when we went through interviews, that's one of the biggest things they wanted besides a larger church. And then this would be the church, there's the existing school, and that might be the parish hall, require some property. It was going to take a bit of an effort. We went through all of the pros and cons to each of those. I'm not going to read all those, but those are developed with the committee, the Long Range Planning Committee. So they're buying into that as we go. Sacred Heart was on a little just under 1 acre. They had a school building that was beautiful old school building that was closed, and when I say closed, it was scheduled for scheduled for demolition. It was, what's the right term? Condemned. Thank you. Yeah. So it gives you an idea of the condition of that. They weren't using the rectory, they weren't using the education center, but they did have this nice church here. Over the years, the public school had bought, which is right here, had bought property off of them, so they weren't going to get that back. They had a park, a city park here. They weren't going to be able to buy land there. And then they had this major street here, so you're not going to cross that street. So acquisition of property here was probably not possible. And that was part of the evaluation. And then we went to the St. Vincent campus, which this is like over 100 acres, but that the diocese owns, but the parish is able to develop that central area, which is about 22 acres. And so we looked at what that meant. Again, one idea was take that gathering space, take that existing church, which was pretty small, and that was the smallest of all the churches, make it into a gathering space. All of this existed, so we would put parish offices over here, build a parish hall here, create parking out here, and then this orange thing is the worship space for 700, which is a footprint of a building that they love in the diocese, okay? It was as simple as that. We need 700, we'll set it there to give you scale. They've got all kinds of space there. The question is not what it looks like, the question is, will it fit? We gave them a little bit of three-dimensional study of the old buildings. All of that existed, and then what we might add. Evaluated things, and through that process, the committee came to the consensus that the St. Vincent campus is what they would like to recommend, okay, to the parish. So we went to the parish, and we did it in 2 sessions. The first session was informational only, and it was to give them all this information, more factual than anything. And the factual part of it tends to dilute the emotional part of it. Nobody wants their church closed, but if you can't get enough parking at that site, or you can't buy enough land at that site, what are you going to do, right? You can't do that. So the first session was informational, and we got 300 people there, and it was just us sharing information. And then about 3 or 4 weeks later, we came back and we did a workshop on what I described earlier, and we got 175 people there. So we put 10 people at a table all the way around the parish hall, and we gave them all questions that we had, thought through, and asked them to come up with their thoughts on that, and report it back. And so each table would then report back to the whole community. And I would say they basically, the question was, or the recommendation was, to go, in fact, this is that presentation, so we took things a little farther, was to pursue moving the parish, building a new church on the St. Vincent site, along with a school. So we didn't share that, but we did study that, because they weren't initially asking that. And the parish agreed that we're now going to be hired to do a master plan for them on that site with all of those elements, so that there's not offices left downtown, there's not a school left downtown. For a while there will be, but because they're not going to raise all this money at once, but there's a plan to get everything out on this site, which again is where also growth is occurring in Vincennes. So I guess in conclusion, that went faster than the first one. Yes. So the question, if I understand it, is how much did the Basilica influence the decision? I would have thought it would have influenced it more, What we learned in this process was the Basilica, and they had a high school and a grade school. You just saw the grade school, but the high school's on it. And they had remote offices downtown, so they were kind of scattered. The schools and the Basilica weren't a part of the equation, and we sort of had to remind them, isn't that part of your mission? That the schools, right? And so what you didn't see was when we presented this to the parish, the first thing was mentioned was the Basilica remains the Basilica. We're not touching it. That's off limits. That land, the building. But the schools became a part of the vision. Yeah. Yes.
What's the motivation to find these four parishes? Financial or more due to the priest shortage?
I think it's both. That they Father Tony was celebrating Mass on Sundays at all four of those. Just here, there, everywhere, right? And the financial side is they've got all that maintenance for all those buildings, and they're not using many of them. So during this process, they discovered that they went ahead and they're pursuing tearing down the one school that I told you that was, and they got probably the consensus from folks that paying insurance and things like that, and having the liability of those properties, that they needed to sort of take them out of the loop. So it was both of those things.
And so, if financial wasn't part of it, in terms of going down the criteria, where would you rank kind of the priest shortage? Our diocese is at a point where we have a lot of financially feasible parishes. We don't have priests.
Well, for you, I would think priests would be pretty high then, right? I think it was high here because that was one of the things. It was interesting. I'm certainly telling you some things you already know about priest shortage, but we had to tell people that again. They would go, well, we could just add another Mass. No, you can't. I mean, he's already going to 5 places on a Sunday, and there is a limit to that. So I would say for you guys, priests, Yes.
Parishes, do they consider
Yeah, I'm not sure I know how to answer that. Yeah.
It would make it easier dissolving campuses and just considered mission because now not the parishes.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not intelligent to that. Yes. So the question was, that's a great question, I should have mentioned that. Was anything reused from each of those parishes? And nothing's been built yet. And the plan is exactly that. When we did our analysis, and I should have mentioned that, there was, does the roof leak? Is the boiler old? Did you sandblast the building? The other part of it was what treasures they had, you know? And so the plan is to incorporate those things. There's wonderful stained glass in 3 of those buildings. There are all of these altars, you know, main altars, side altars in these buildings. And I would think too, we would incorporate those, and we would incorporate the architecture. There's wonderful, if you notice, the facade of those buildings was beautiful masonry work, you know. So I think our effort would be to somehow tie those things in. That's the history of the parish. And I think that would help in that transition, you know, that, oh, there's the altar from St. Vincent, you know, or whatever, right? Yeah, we've done that in a few places where we've taken stained glass from the old building, old church, and repurposed it in the new building. And that means a lot to folks. And it makes church, you know, it really does. Yes?
Curious, you keep saying sandblasting, is that detrimental to a building where you can't do it multiple times?
So the question is sandblasting detrimental to brick masonry, that you can't do it more than once? You shouldn't do it at all. What it does is it takes the fired face of a clay brick off and makes it permeable to water, which then deteriorates the brick either through freeze thaw or erosion or, yeah. So.
California, there's not many brick buildings.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, around here we have got a lot of brick and a lot of sandblasted brick, unfortunately.
I was going to ask, out of curiosity, do these parishes consider outsourcing priests like from India or Africa or anything like that before it's a priest shortage? I mean, did they look at that option, or why was that, I guess, a contributing factor?
You know, I know the Archdiocese of Indianapolis does that. Does the Diocese of Lafayette, Andy? Do you? A little bit? Yeah. That's a diocesan, you know, that's the bishop determining that. Apparently that didn't figure into the equation. And I know when Father Tony was sent there, you know, some guys are sent to build and some guys are sent to straighten the school out or whatever. He was sent to unify. Okay? So somewhere prior to that, they decided they weren't going to send anybody else, either from the diocese, which they probably didn't have, or from outside. Yeah. Andy?
You probably already said this, were any of the parishes underpopulated?
Were any of the parishes underpopulated? The one in the country, St. Thomas, was. Yeah, there were hardly any folks there. That also made it a little easier. The other ones were, you know, pretty well populated, I think.
But that 700 seat
Yeah, that was the goal on but we couldn't get 700 seats on any of those sites and make it work. Well, Well, thank you very much. Oh,
At what point does it make sense to put the for sale sign? After the master planning is done, I imagine to move forward on building this parish, you need funds, right?
yes, they'll need funds. So the question is about the properties and how are they going to handle them. So the other component of this was they have developed a subcommittee on properties and how are they going to deal with them, because that was probably the biggest question that they had. One was about the treasures. What are you going to do with our stained glass? And so we had already addressed that. The other one was, what are you going to do with this property? And so I had told Father, put together a committee that studies that and, talk with the community, talk with the mayor, talk with the Boys and Girls Club or the Y or whatever about repurposing some of these, they could be an asset to the community, but you got to be active on that. So there's a committee looking into that. Kind of like if they were going to buy property, you would put together a real estate group that would work really quietly, and I think I mentioned this in the other group, but I had a parish that I've been working with for 10 years now, and when we did the master plan, they needed to acquire property, and they have now acquired over a dozen properties, and the one guy would buy it kind of quietly and then remove what was on there, and they began using it for parking or green space or whatever, and now they're realizing the master plan on all that property, closing a road and stuff like that, but they were very careful not to let out what they were doing, because as soon as one guy and the neighbors figure that out, the price goes up. And so you have to have a strategy for buying or repurposing or whatever, and that's what they're in the process of doing.
What was the final estimate on your cost for this? When are they going to start the capital campaign?
So we did not do a cost on this, okay? Because the question was, where do we go? Okay? They're going to do where we ended up was, we're going to do a master plan, and in that master plan, we will identify a cost. At the end of a master plan, typically what happens is there's a financial feasibility study. You hire a fundraiser, and they tell you with more than that, but along those lines, a master plan, they'll go to the 40 biggest donors, and they'll say, do you support the idea of a new church out at St. Vincent de Paul's campus that might seat 700, and to what extent? And they'll come back and they'll tell them, you can raise $10 to $12 million. And then if that's the right number, then we would start detailed design and give them information to do a full capital campaign where they're actually getting pledges and donations. Yes?
Do they factor the property value of each location into this at all?
They did not, but that's part of what. The thing is, none of those sites worked. For their vision, what the bishop asked them to do, you got to build a church for 700. None of those could support that. And then when they further thought about it, none of those studies showed a school. If they don't, they don't have enough room on those city blocks to do that.
Last question, there was some mention about this diocesan property. Was this designed to go into the diocesan property?
It could, yeah. And we're in the process of. Is it me? Okay. They have a group that wants to build tennis courts for the high school ahead of this, and the bishop is like, it doesn't look right, and trying to you know, do the tennis courts come before the church or whatever, and we're dialoguing with the bishop on that. Yeah. Huh? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you all.